British tanks back. The Germans raced on. March 24th, 2003. 3 days into the strike-deep phase of the U.S. Blitzkrieg battle plan, and Operation Iraqi Freedom is on target. The regular Iraqi army has been brushed aside and effectively disappears. The bridgehead west of Nasiriyah is seized. The 1st Marine Division has now arrived and is crossing, while the tanks of the 3rd Infantry have advanced more than 250 miles and isolated both Samawa and Najaf. Behind them, a convoy of 2,700 resupply vehicles, escorted by Apache helicopters of the 101st Airborne, has advanced almost 200 miles and established a FARP, a forward area refueling position for 3rd Infantry. And troops are leapfrogging by helicopter to establish FARPs even further on.
As you know, our forces have been moving rapidly. We've intentionally bypassed enemy formations to include paramilitary and the Fedayeen.
But Tommy Franks has put his finger on the fact that his deep-striking forces are just as vulnerable as the Germans were in 1940. March 24th, 2003. At Nasiriyah, already identified as a choke point, the Marines move in to seize more bridges in the town. They intend to roll around potential strongpoints. But the lead units take a wrong turn and become involved in confused fighting with the Fedayeen and Ba'ath Party fanatics. The Marines are forced to go down what they term Ambush Alley and lose several vehicles. Eventually, the bridges are seized for the Marines to cross. But it takes the follow-up troops of Task Force Tarawa more than a week to secure the town so that supply columns can use the bridges unhindered.
I don't think anyone came into here thinking it was going to be a cakewalk. We knew that there were cells like the Republican Guard. We just didn't know when we'd run into them.
Elsewhere on the long road to Baghdad, Operation Iraqi Freedom could not avoid the other inherent problem of Lightning War: logistics. The coalition supply columns snake north in seemingly unending lines. The attack units in front of them are armored. The supply vehicles are soft-skinned, therefore vulnerable.
The Iraqis could have exploited this by using what might be called the savage rabbit defense. If the Iraqi forces had waited for the coalition forces to bypass them and then emerge from their holes, as it were, to attack the supply units, the maintenance units, the logistics units, then they could have inflicted quite a bit of damage and forced the coalition forces to stop, maybe even turn around.
The Fedayeen and other paramilitaries do launch sporadic attacks on the supply columns, but it is never a consistent plan.
Certainly there have been some harassing attacks on our supply lines, and they continue. But they have not stopped the movement of our logistics support forward to each of our fielded forces. We continue to provide self-protection to those. What we note is those attacks have become fewer with fewer forces, and they have all been defeated with relatively minimal cost to our forces.
But in the fog of war, with troops exhausted, accidents happen. Near Nasiriyah, one resupply unit becomes lost and ends up in a firefight, with some of its members killed and others captured, including Private Jessica Lynch. The logistics problem also caught up with the German battle plan in World War II. On May 25th, 2 weeks after the launch of their Blitzkrieg, they had the British and French armies trapped at Dunkirk. The tanks might have swept on and taken the trapped men, but they stopped, and over 350,000 British and French troops were able to escape from the beaches.
Interestingly, historically, it seems to be that around the 250-mile mark, armies tend to run out of steam. If you measure the distance from the start point of the German attack through the Ardennes, through the route that they took to the Dunkirk perimeter, it works out at very roughly 250 miles.
The German advance was so fast that it outran its backup. This was largely because, despite propaganda film of tanks and trucks, more than 90% of the German army was still reliant on its foot soldiers and horses. Over 60 years later, on March 25th, the U.S. commanders, like their German counterparts, decide that a halt must be made to regroup before completing their campaign with the assault on Baghdad. As they do so, another sort of fog of war strikes their advance, the Shamal, blinding sandstorms. Frank's 3rd Division halts. The lighter armored Marines stop their advance, so as not to get too far ahead. The decision is misinterpreted by many journalists. The media assumes that the advance has stalled and that the American military face another Vietnam. In fact, the Americans are resting and, more importantly, resupplying.
To the uninitiated, some of the things that happened during Iraqi freedom looked as though Blitzkrieg was failing, but to those that understood the history of Blitzkrieg, these were common problems that the Americans were trying to overcome.
Then, on April 2nd, the race to Baghdad is unleashed again. West of the Euphrates, Apache gunships of the 101st Airborne attacked the Iraqi Republican Guard Medina Division near Karbala. U.S. Rangers seized the Hadithan Dam on the outskirts of Karbala to stop the Iraqis blowing it and flooding the area. U.S. 3rd Infantry pushes around the city, seizes the main bridge on the road to Baghdad, and begins to probe towards the capital. East of the Euphrates, one Marine column reaches Diwaniyah, but instead of continuing direct towards Baghdad, swings northeast to cross the Tigris west of Kut. This bypasses the city, which the Iraqis had been preparing to defend. The Marines then head for Baghdad. On April 3rd, an armored company from 3rd Infantry Division reaches and takes Baghdad Airport. The expected resistance does not take place. But the interlude is deceptive, the result of the speed of the American advance. Not expecting the enemy so quickly, the defenders have gone underground to sleep. When they wake up, a fierce counterattack takes place, and fighting for the airport rages for more than 24 hours. The Marines approaching from the east also encounter more determined resistance. But by April 6th, they too are pushing into the city. It takes 2 more days for U.S. forces to close off Baghdad completely. Then, a Marine engineer team helps excited Iraqi civilians pull down the statue of Saddam Hussein in Firdos Square. But the capture of Baghdad Airport had effectively marked the end of the battle plan for Blitzkrieg in Iraq, just as the halt at Dunkirk had marked the end of the German Blitzkrieg in northern France. Both armies, over 60 years apart, had shown how Blitzkrieg could be a triumphant success. But if one looks at how they each stacked up, both against the requirements of the Blitzkrieg battle plan and its weaknesses, there are interesting similarities and contrasts. Both commanders deceived the enemy and controlled the air. In the breakthrough and strike deep phases of the battle plan, the relative technological balance between each side and its enemy played a crucial role. Except in the air, the Germans had no particular advantage in numbers or equipment. They achieved overwhelming force where it was needed by grouping their panzer divisions together and then using them ruthlessly. In contrast, the Americans used the enormous technological superiority of their weapons and communications to overwhelm an enemy which theoretically greatly outnumbered them. But there were cautionary final notes which showed that even a high-tech Blitzkrieg is exposed to the same inherent problems that the Germans encountered in 1940. The Germans faced 2 attempted counterattacks, but both were poorly coordinated and ineffective. The psychological power of their Blitzkrieg had stunned their enemy. The American combat units had little problem with the regular Iraqi army, or even the Republican Guard. Their problems came further back. The skill of the American logistics units helped to sustain the extraordinarily rapid advance, but only up to the same sort of 250-mile distance that the Germans had achieved. Then, even with trucks and helicopters, rather than feet and horses, a halt became inevitable. And for the Americans, this long logistics train turned out to be particularly vulnerable to guerrilla action by relatively unsophisticated enemy troops. It was a different form of counterattack, which could have given them considerable problems had the Iraqis used it more consistently. The major problems that the coalition would later face, the follow-up phase of Blitzkrieg, came only after the amazing success of the Blitzkrieg battle plan. But this only emphasizes another lesson that the Germans had learned over 60 years before, that ultimately, a mass army is needed on the ground to secure it after the first rapid victories. For the long-term future, there was a new factor.
The lesson of Operation Iraqi Freedom, I think, is that you can either have a large force that moves slowly or a small force that moves quickly, but you can't have a large force that moves rapidly. That I think we'll see in the future a great deal of use of the Blitzkrieg battle plan, but on a smaller scale. That it's unlikely that we will see a repetition of the large-scale Blitzkrieg attacks of the Second World War, or even of Desert Storm, until someone solves the problem of large battle tanks that require 6 gallons of fuel for every mile that they travel.
The wheel has come full circle in the battle plan for Blitzkrieg. Once again, the way commanders fight this fast-moving, hard-hitting type of warfare is being limited by the capability